What's the best story a video game has ever produced? Is it the fury-driven yet humbling tale of a father learning to connect with his son in hopes that the boy will become something more? Maybe it's the journey of an outlaw trapped in an era where his way of life is being not only cast to the wayside, but outright destroyed. Perhaps it's a hidden narrative hiding behind a cryptic set of clues waiting to be discovered by passionate fans. Or maybe it's the stories that an emotional stroll through the desert allowed a gamer to create for themselves. All of these stories, as well as many more, are all celebrated and heralded amongst the seemingly endless population of gamers, and rightfully so. But what makes these stories so incredible is not the over-the-top set pieces, the way gameplay interacts with narrative, or even how characters grow and change along the way. Sure, those things are all important. However, the thing that a story must do for humans to connect to it is to appeal to our empathy by lighting a small flame of emotion within us and allowing it to erupt into a burning fire by the game's conclusion. A story carries meaning with us when it's human, including both the light and dark sides that exist within all of us. And no video game story carries more of these emotional elements than What Remains of Edith Finch. In 2017, Giant Sparrow released their second production, and it told the traumatic tale of the Finch family line, a group of people living in a world surrounded by death. For seemingly generation upon generation, the family experienced many unexpected and premature deaths, and this trend didn't end after they moved to Orcas Island off the coast of Washington State. After becoming the last family member left alive, 17-year-old Edith Finch travels back to her childhood home to uncover the mysteries of her family's past and the truth of the so-called Finch family curse. The player experiences a series of short vignettes that tell the stories of deceased family members, but before this, the game opens on someone sailing towards an island with the journal of Edith Finch in hand. As the title screen disappears and the journal opens via a hand wrapped up tight in a cast, a visualization of the words in Edith's journal come to life, and the player is whisked away to the outskirts of the Finch home. It is in this moment where players can truly step into the shoes of Edith, as neither of you has any concrete understanding of what to expect. In a way, you're both new to this area. Sure, Edith grew up there, but many of the circumstances surrounding the home and family deaths were never shared with or fully comprehended by her. You both will undergo the same journey, and what's better at bringing people together and forming bonds than shared experiences? As the player takes the first steps forwards, undoubtedly, the first thing their eyes will notice is the towering structure before them. This is the Finch family home. Its bizarre structure and seemingly endless building code violations act as a perfect visual metaphor for the behavior and attitudes of the family. The player doesn't know it yet, but the crux of the story will be about how humans deal with loss and grief and how it can manifest in different ways within people. Our playable character, Edith, is our baseline perspective. The things she uncovers will be new to both her and the player. However, this game's true main character is Edith's great-grandmother, Edie, and how her inability to cope with loss perpetuated decades of familial losses. But she's not a villain though, she's just a broken and delusional person, and we will see this as the video progresses. For now, Edith works her way towards her old home with a feeling of uneasiness ever present. She reveals that her brother Milton had disappeared early in her life and that her brother Lewis's death was the catalyst that drove Edith and her mother Dawn away from the house for good. For the first time in 7 years, Edith lays her eyes on the entirety of the Finch family home, and the player truly comes to understand what a bizarre structure it is. At the base is seemingly a normal home, but to one side, a large appendage bursts upwards towards the heavens. The player will come to understand that this odd extension from a regular home represents Edie's departure from reality. To one side of the house is a dragon-shaped metal structure laying waste in a pond. Edith comments that Edie joked with her that the beast had killed her husband. The humor elements of Edie's mournful words give a small taste of what's to come. Making their way around the house to its other side, players are greeted with a vista showcasing a detached swing set. Meanwhile, an ominous structure glows in the sea while a statue dutifully watches over it. It's here where Edith first enters her family home for the first time in 7 years, and there's no way to ignore the haunting vibes that the old creaking house gives off. Edith's fearful disposition towards approaching the house aids the sensation that maybe there's a paranormal element to the game. It's almost like if at any moment a jump scare could be coming. Another thing many will notice quickly is just how much stuff is packed into the home. Pictures and books litter every floor of the home, and everything is a mess. The home feels lived in, as small details give the player more insight, like this announcement of Lewis's funeral information or this family picture where Edith celebrates her birthday with Edie, Dawn, and Lewis. It's easy to comprehend and connect with, yet the lack of actual people in the home leaves it ultimately feeling eerie. Edith really describes the house perfectly when she says,
"Nothing in the house looked abnormal. There was just too much of it, like a smile with too many teeth."
After peering into the sealed-off library, Edith comments that this is the location where her great-grandmother said that all the Finches are buried. This comment will take on new meaning as we learn how Edie memorialized all the deceased family members. Moving upwards, we learn that Edith's mom sealed off all the rooms of the deceased family members following Milton's disappearance, which was against Edie's wishes. Edie retaliated by drilling peepholes into all the rooms, clinging as much as she could to the shrines she had constructed in each room. Entering Walter's room, the player quickly discovers a book called 20 Leagues Under the Sea. It's a small detail hinting at how Walter lived his life, but for now, it serves as an entryway into Molly's room, after Edith discovers that the key her mother left her allows her to access a secret passage. As we will come to see, each family member's room gives insights into their personalities and hobbies of characters that we will never meet, and Molly's room starts this trend. Molly was the first child of Edie, born in 1937, and her room paints us a picture of her lifestyle. The standard pink room of a 10-year-old girl feels immediately familiar, but examining it more closely reveals that Molly was a lover of science, as she has creatures in jars and a microscope examining a butterfly. She also had a fascination with sea life, as posters of ocean depth charts and a jellyfish plushie can be found in her room. At her desk, we discovered the memorial that Edie created for her first child after Molly died at age 10 in 1947. Above the desk, we see a poster Molly has drawn, where her dad is attacked by a giant sea dragon while she is stuck in a castle. It reminds the player of the dragon object in the pond that they saw earlier, and how Edie said it had killed her husband. Edie clearly led Molly to believe that a dragon had eaten her father as he attempted to protect her. She probably told her daughter this story so that the young girl's lasting image of her father would be of a heroic man who fought bravely to protect her, in hopes that this would help the young girl cope with the situation. That's how it might appear anyway, until you realize Sven hadn't died until years after Molly's death, meaning that Edie had actually been the one to draw this poster and hang it here. This, paired with Edie's insistence that a dragon ate her husband, shows that the woman was creating alternative stories in her mind, and for now, that's all we know. Opening Molly's journal, Edith discovers a haunting story written by Molly, which details the events of her last night alive. She opens by acknowledging that soon she will be gone, chilling words for a 10-year-old to write. The player then takes control of Molly on her last night alive as she consumes toothpaste and holly berries to appease her appetite after her mother Edie sent her to bed without supper. Molly then begins to have visions as the strange tale of food chains play out and get weirder and weirder with each new development. The player slowly realizes that Molly died because of ingesting poisonous items, and these visions are hallucinations. It's heart-wrenching to think about a 10-year-old girl dying in such a preventable way, but it gets even harder when Edith closes Molly's tale by saying that Edie used to spend a lot of time in this room before it was sealed. Imagine for a second the traumatic scene of Edie entering Molly's room the next morning only to find her child dead, and the guilt and the shame that she must have felt after discovering her neglect created this outcome. The game never shows the player this, but sets up all the pieces for you to create the image in your head and to feel the emotional impact of that moment. Edie had lost before. Her father died at sea, but this situation is so much more unbearable due to it being the loss of a child in a preventable way. It's this event that created a crossroads for Edie, to either deal with the loss in a healthy way or to avoid dealing with her pain. A human's mind can break during these situations, and unfortunately, that's what happens to Edie. Once again, we take control of Edith, and her only way forward is out the window to the balcony where she can access Edie and Sven's room. Here, the player learns a lot about Edie. Her unwillingness to leave the house during an outbreak of forest fires shows her obsession with this place. Her story about a mole man living under the house and a dragon eating her husband shows her fixation on fantasy situations. And her unfinished portrait of Edith's deceased brother Lewis shows how deeply her obsession with immediately memorializing fallen family members had become. More signs of a broken human being. An old-style film reel located in Edie's room shows off the story of her father Odin, and it's here where the story first introduces the idea of the Finch family curse. Allegedly, for centuries, the family had lived in Sweden, but a series of untimely deaths led to the need for a change of scenery. For years, the family had suffered tragic losses, and Odin believed by moving to America, he could leave the curse behind. But his unwillingness to fully let go of the concept of the curse led him to bring his home with him across the sea until it crashed and took him with it. Only his daughter Edie, her husband Sven, and their baby daughter Molly survived, and they quickly began building a new home adjacent to the ship's crash site. In one picture, Edith sees that the family cemetery had been built even before the new home could be finished. It's evidence that Edie would carry the concept of the family curse that had plagued her family for generations with her, despite moving far away from her homeland. The idea of the curse lived on and became her main coping method upon each subsequent family death. Moving through another hidden passage, we discover a dark room where photographs were developed. It leads to the room of two twin boys, Calvin and Sam, two of Edie's children. The room is one of the most fascinating to view throughout the house, as two distinct themes contrast nicely with the similarity that is associated with twins. Sam's side of the room is painted orange, with armed forces posters and hunting pictures covering the walls. On the other side, roped off, is Calvin's half, where deep purple walls, aid the space memorabilia strewed throughout. Calvin's vignette is highlighted by a poem his brother Sam wrote for him following his funeral. Sam talked about how the death of their sister Barbara fueled them to be braver, and Calvin took this mindset to new heights. Literally. The player experiences Calvin's last moments as he attempted to swing so high that the swing itself wrapped around the tree it was connected to, but unfortunately he lost his grip and was cast over a cliff to his death. The player doesn't see this, of course, as when Calvin leaves the swing, a white light consumes him, as Sam ends his poem by saying that Calvin truly accomplished his goal of flying on that day. It's a touching sentiment written by a young boy in pain, and it leaves the idea that maybe Calvin accomplished his goal of traveling in space by flying off the swing into the stars. Back to reality, and while leaving, it's hard to not notice how incredible this bedroom is. It's a place where a child's imagination could run free, and for many years, it was just that. But now, it carries a seriously creepy connotation when it's revealed that Sam had to live in this room for 7 years following Calvin's death, with nothing on the deceased brother's room changing at all. Imagine the mental exhaustion that must have engulfed Sam in his teen years. Edie had surely put the idea of a family curse into his mind, 2 of his sisters had already died, and now his closest friend, his twin brother, had died too, and he couldn't escape it, as every day he woke up to Calvin's memorial. After age 18, Sam never stepped in the room again, and Edith reflects on how he never really spoke of his twin brother. At the same time as Sam coped with his brother's death, his mother Edie was surely becoming more and more consumed by her despair. At this point, 3 of her 5 children had died, and surely the hefty weight of burden she must have felt was crippling. From what we've been told, Edie had coped by attributing the deaths to the family curse, but from what we can see, neglectful parenting was becoming a harmful trend in her life. The player has already learned that Molly died of eating poisonous berries after being punished by being sent to bed with no dinner, and now Calvin's death results from a swing set being built way too close to a massive cliff. Hell, even Edith comments that Calvin's death felt personal despite the fact that she had never known him, because she spent time on that same swing. I mean, think about that for a minute. Even though a child had died from it, Edie never elected to remove the swing to prevent the disaster from happening again. At this point, the seeds of doubt begin to emerge in players, as maybe Edie's stories of curses aren't based in reality, and maybe the creepy elements of the house aren't so paranormal after all. Both the player and Edith are hungry for more information. A stronger connection to the story is taking root as the truth of it all begins to emerge. Pushing onwards leads Edith to Barbara's room, the older sister of Calvin, Sam, and Walter, and Edie's second child after Molly. Barbara was a childhood star whose scream earned her prominent roles in horror movies, but as she reached adolescence, her voice changed, and so did her career. She was washed up and went from a life of fame to a life of mediocrity. Imagine the psychological damage that Barbara must have underwent from being loved and adored as a child to being ridiculed and ignored as a teenager. The comic book outlining the events of Barbara's last night hint at this, as she was trying to regain her old scream to break through at a horror fest. She clearly wanted to get back into the limelight. Even Edith comments that Barbara just wanted to be remembered. Adolescence is a formative time in a person's life, and Barbara's condition makes it easy to sympathize with her. Barbara never got her big break though, as she was most likely killed by her boyfriend when she was just a teenager. The only account of Barbara's death in her room is a comic book, and Edith comments on how strange it was that this was the story that Edie decided to memorialize her daughter with. But upon further inspection, it makes complete sense given Edie's MO. Edie had to take Sven to the hospital on the night of Barbara's murder, and even though this death wasn't preventable like the previous two, Edie still felt a tremendous amount of guilt due to the what-if nature of the situation. What if Sven hadn't cut himself? What if they didn't leave the house that night? Would Barbara still be alive? Instead of learning to cope with this, Edie doubled down on the curse's presence, which is evidenced by the fact that Barbara's memorial doesn't contain a real account for her death, but instead, a comic book, with made-up stories of real monsters and hook-handed killers. The fictional nature of the story fed well into Edie's disillusionment, and it helped preserve Barbara in Edie's mind in a way that drew upon her daughter's happiest times, her acting career. It's a glorifying and Hollywoodized version of a very gruesome story, and it again alludes to Edie's inability to cope with losing a child. Our next vignette explores not only the fallout of Barbara's death, but also the consequences of Edie's insistence on sharing and spreading the concept of a family curse. It's in Walter's stories where we not only begin to see that Edie's curse isn't real, but that her fixation on it had very real consequences for her family. You see, her inability to cope not only affected herself, but also those around her. After most likely witnessing part of Barbara's demise, Walter sheltered himself into an underground bunker a few years after her death. This decision was obviously influenced by Edie's insistence that the family curse was to blame, as evidenced by the fact that Walter believes a monster is coming for him and that it most likely was the same thing that killed his siblings. Perhaps the comic book outlining Barbara's death really struck a chord with Walter, and it led him to a life of paranoia that the curse would get him next. So he sheltered himself in, living under the family house for 30 years. Edie's insistence on a nonsensical curse infected Walter's mindset and led him to sacrificing the idea of having a real life for himself. Even Edie herself supported this decision as well. She came down with packages and food to keep Walter fed. All the while, new generations were being born into the Finch household, unaware that a man lived below. It recontextualizes Edie's story of a mole man living under the house. She sold out her own son to continue perpetuating the idea that a mystical and fantastical element surrounded the Finch family. All of this was a result of Edie's refusal to accept that neglectful parenting was the real cause for the death of her children. Just like Walter, who buried himself deeper and deeper into the ground to escape the family curse, Edie too buried her guilt and grief deeper and deeper into her subconscious, and her family suffered the consequences. After reflecting on the story's experience so far, both Edith and the player start to truly doubt the non-fictional curse element of the tale, and instead begin to understand that negligence and a lack of accountability were the true killers. The concept of a curse is exposed to be nothing more than a cover-up to avoid dealing with the negative emotions that would surely come from losing so many family members. It's not to say that Edie didn't truly believe in a curse. She sure as hell did, but her perception of it didn't make it reality. The rest of the title then becomes about exploring how negligent parenting became a disease that affected the next 3 generations of Finches. But before the player can get to that though, Edith spends some time reflecting in the family cemetery. It's hinted at and later confirmed that Edith is deep into a pregnancy term when she returned to the house, and that her words are actually written to her unborn child. She feels an extreme pressure to make a tough choice, either let her son know her family's past, or to let the concept of a curse die with her so that it may not affect any more generations. Ultimately, she decides it's more important for her to be honest with her child and leaves it up to him to think what he will think. As Edith approaches the family cemetery, the most important line of the game is uttered, a fact that has haunted the Finches since their arrival to Orca's Island, and how it's even the reason that this video is titled the way it is.
I think we've been surrounded by death for so long, we've just gotten used to it. What kind of family finishes building a cemetery before starting the house?
The Finches have known life only within the confines of death. Trapped by the neediness of childhood, every member of the Finch family grew up with the idea of a curse fully planted into their minds. Everywhere they looked, some sort of connection to death could be found. Molly grew up exposed to statues of her grandfather Odin's death and an easily accessible film reel outlining the curse of the Finches. And every Finch after that was exposed to more and more instances of death, and Edie's fixation on preserving the memory of the deceased. Even those that moved away for a time eventually returned, as if the house and the curse were magnets and each person was metal. Death engulfed the Finch family, and it defined their everyday life, and it was all because of Edie's stories and her obsession with the curse. After embracing her own form of parental negligence by walking on a tree branch 7 months pregnant, Edith reaches her grandpa Sam's room. Sam's story really hits hard, as he lost his father, 3 of his 4 siblings, and 2 of his children, all before he died young himself. We never really get a good look at Edie during the game, but Sam's a different story. Just seeing his face makes him easier to understand. And if that weren't it, the player can clearly tell what kind of man Sam was. A former military veteran and avid hunter who also had a keen love of photography. He was a family man whose family fell apart. His death story gives Edith a better understanding of not only him, but more so her mother, as it's revealed Dawn was a witness to her father's death. In a way, Dawn's story is as tragic as her father's. She lost 2 brothers while growing up, her father fell off a cliff on what was supposed to be a bonding weekend for the two, and as the player will come to realize, she also lost 2 of her own sons while doing everything she could to prevent her past becoming her future. Sam's death is the point where the title introduces Edith's mother Dawn to the story so that we can better understand her just as much as we've come to understand Edie. Over the next few stories, Edith learns not only of Edie's continued losses, but also her mother Dawn's losses. The next vignette is brutal on the emotions, as the player learns the story of Gregory, a 1-year-old infant who drowned while left unattended in the bathtub. Gregory's story, like a few others across the game, plays out in an upbeat and jovial way to cover up the grim reality of what has occurred. It's symbolism for the family's obsession with the curse, an unrealistic portrayal of events that occurred. Gregory's story is actually recapped in the comment section of divorce papers served up to Sam by Kay. To lose a child is particularly heart-wrenching, but to lose an infant is even more taxing. Imagine the devastation to Sam and Kay, knowing that Gregory relied entirely on them to care for him, and to know that they failed. It's emotionally exhausting. So far, after every journal entry, Edith has commented on the deceased or their connection to Edie. It's telling then that she doesn't speak a word after Gregory's entry, a clear sign of her empathy, given that she is also bearing a child. In the same military barrack-esque room, we find the bed of Dawn's brother Gus. Gus's story reflects the rebellious spirit of youth, especially growing up under the surveillance of a military dad like Sam. The fact that he gives his dad the middle finger at the wedding, paired with the mohawk style of his hair, is evidence of his rebellious nature. Just like with the relationships between the rest of the characters in the game, there's a narrative to infer here. Sam, a veteran himself, probably raised his kids in an authoritarian way, in hopes that discipline may lead to his children not having the same fate as his siblings. Meanwhile, Gus, a child who never knew his aunts or uncles, only knows a life where his dad is firm but fair, which is oftentimes interpreted as being unfair when you're a teenager. This dynamic of conflict between the two is shown off in Gus's demise, as he mentally checks out from his father's second wedding. He comments that he and Dawn don't need a stepmother, clearly unable to interpret the surge of energy and happiness that a new romance would bring to his divorcee dad. Gus is self-interested and verbally and behaviorally makes his discontent known by outright protesting the wedding by flying a kite instead of engaging in the day's events. Ultimately, Gus is killed when a storm whips up and sends the makeshift wedding tent hurtling at him. And while it's sad, it's not really the point. The point comes when the player realizes just how much information they've inferred about the relationship between Sam and Gus, even with just the slightest bit of clues. The game has forced both you and Edith to think deeper about the relationships between these people. The relationships aren't fully defined and laid out for either of you, and both of you have to simply use your own experiences in life to try to better understand who the deceased were as people and how they coexisted. In other words, you have to start to think about them as humans. Very powerful. Climbing further upwards, Edith reaches her mother's loft, where she quickly alludes to her father Sanjay and how his death eventually led a distraught Dawn to move her and two brothers back into the family home. Despite relying heavily on the house to be a place to raise her children, Dawn still insisted on telling her children that the family curse was just a myth. She took on homeschooling her children, and posters exploring fact versus fiction of the Finch family, and a poster telling the story of Odin are evidence of her trying to teach her children that the curse wasn't real. After bonding so much after Sam's death, Dawn and Edie fought a lot more this time around, especially after the disappearance of Milton, Edith's brother. Milton is confirmed by the developers of the game to be the king of their other title, The Unfinished Swan, but in this story, Milton is a boy who vanished. The player can piece together that the disappearance of Milton was the catalyst that fueled the downfall of the relationship between Dawn and Edie. After Milton vanished, Edie quickly put a tombstone up in the family graveyard, despite his mother's insistence that it was just a monument. Following this, Dawn sealed up all the rooms, hoping to end the idea of a curse so that no more Finches would die believing in this fictitious concept. But Edie was not to be outdone. She drilled peepholes into the doors, grasping as hard as she could to her memories of those deaths. Even when new family members came along, Edie elected to build extensions to the house instead of clearing out the rooms of the deceased for new occupants. It's clear evidence that she lived in the past, and her fixation on an unsolvable and unstoppable curse meant her mind never had to truly heal from the losses that she sustained. So far into the game, Edith and the player have heard stories of deaths of all kinds. Murder, accidental, death by poison, death by falling, death by blunt force trauma, and so on and so forth. But one kind of extremely personal death has yet to be addressed, and the game saves it for the end: suicide. Each of the death stories is of course tragic, but Lewis's is so much more so, because it feels preventable. If people had thought more critically about the signs, maybe something could have been done. Lewis was a recovering drug addict whose withdrawal from that lifestyle left reality feeling quite dull. Any experience was possible on drugs, and the real world could never match that. With help from his family, he did manage to get clean, an event that can be pointed to as a success, but ultimately people failed to follow up with him, and it led him to take his own life. In the game's finest example of blending narrative and gameplay, players experience Lewis's state of mind firsthand, just as he does. As Lewis gets more and more engrossed in the story in his head, it swells, engulfing the screen and demanding the player's full attention. All the while, the act of removing fish heads becomes muscle memory. Without the aid of drugs, Lewis had to dream up his own fun and create his own worlds, and slowly but surely, he lost connection with reality. Until the point where he decided that the only way to step into the world of his imagined existence was to end his existence in the real world. For anyone who has ever lost someone or felt suicidal themselves, it strikes a nerve, because we as players can see the signs that were there, but no one else considered them until it was too late. I mean, what can we say? The game truly saves its most powerful vignette for last. At this point, Edith and the player have almost come full circle, and all that's left to explore is how this human tragedy ends. As Edith climbs further up the makeshift and seemingly unsafe tower of rooms, she reaches her mother's room. It's revealed that after Lewis's funeral, Dawn blamed Edie's stories for the death and disappearance of her two sons, and she insisted that her and Edith needed to leave for good. Imagine the pain of a woman who has spent her whole life trying to run from Edie's stories so that they wouldn't engulf her or her kids, only to see that happen in the end. Reaching Edith's room the night her and her mother left is recapped. The player is treated to one last clue of Edie's negligence when she insists on drinking wine with her meal, knowing that it shouldn't be consumed while she's on the medication that she is. As the two adults fight over curses, stories, and painful losses, Edith discovers a book that Edie began to write. Edie shares a wild story of the night that Edith was born, in which the tide went way out and she was able to reach her old sunken home. A light came on in the old home, but before Edith can finish reading the story and see what Edie was gonna say, her mom comes in and rips the book away from her. Players may feel like they've been cheated of some supernatural answer to the curse's existence, but upon further inspection, that story really doesn't hold up. Edie would have been 82 years old on the night of Edith's birth, so how could a woman so elderly navigate fog and rocky terrain so easily? And a light coming on in a house that had been waterlogged for over a century makes no sense either. Whether Edie truly believes the story or not isn't the relevant point. The relevant point is that it's not based in any sort of reality. There is no answer to the curse's origin because there is no curse. Finally, escaping the home for good, Dawn went on to die of an illness a few years later. An unfortunate premature death, especially given her family's history. It's a sad coincidence. As for Edith, she too passed while delivering her child into the world. She ends the story by saying how she wants to meet her son and share these stories with him in person, not through a book. But sadly, it doesn't turn out this way. Edith dies from childhood complications at the mere age of 17. The game fades away as Edith's son approaches her grave at the old family home. Without any other family members to consistently fill his head with the idea of a family curse, only the words written by Edith continue the legacy. For the first time, a Finch is free to weigh all the possibilities for himself to decide what truly led to so much death within the family. In the end, he is now all that remains of Edith Finch. Curse or negligence? It's the final question players must answer for themselves when the game concludes. The answer to this will vary, but I'd say most fans of the title have settled on negligent parenting being the ultimate downfall of so many Finches. And it's a result of Edie's inability to cope with loss. She instead chose to perpetuate fictional accounts of how family members died under mysterious or fantastical conditions. The game does an incredible job at teaching players about its characters with environmental detail, but one stands out above all the rest, and it really answers the question that was posed a moment ago. Halfway through the title, as Edith ventures through the family cemetery, she comes to the grave of Edie herself, a woman who perished the night that Dawn and Edith left. All the tombstones here have symbols highlighting what each person loved most in life. For Edie, that monument is a book. She was a storyteller, a woman living in the past, a woman who had suffered incredible loss throughout her life and experienced a gambit of negative and self-defeating emotions. Unable to make peace with her guilt-ridden subconscious, she never moved on and gave her life to maintain the past. She built monuments to the dead, preserved their rooms in pristine condition, and never let anyone destroy those memories. She was a woman with many burdens, but she wasn't evil. She simply had a defense mechanism to keep herself going, but it wasn't a healthy one. In the end, What Remains of Edith Finch is a story about coping with grief, and how one family failed to do so properly for 4 generations, and perhaps many more. It's a heartbreaking story of broken people, some of whom tried to be better, but instead were met with continued misfortune. It evokes empathy from all its players. Sure, not every story will garner an emotional response from every individual, but you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't get a bit choked up at least one of the tales. Because each story touches on a different facet of loss, at least one of which a player has probably experienced. It appeals to our human nature and easily breaks through the mental barricades we use to protect ourselves from exposing our emotional sides. It makes you care about characters that you've never met and how you've hardly even seen their faces. It elicits emotional responses from us and makes the story as memorable as any. Death will come for all of us at some point, whether it be sooner or later. Life is actually the abnormal state, as we will be dead for far more years than we will be alive. We live life within the confines of death, and the Finch family story teaches us to appreciate the little time we have and to do the best we can to not replicate their mistakes, but instead to address our shortcomings, our faults, our guilts, and our desires so that we may grow as people and simultaneously allow for others to grow alongside of us. What Remains of Edith Finch is a story of lives within death. It's the story of human emotion, and it's the best story you can find in a video game. Thanks for watching.